I want to tell you that it's my delight to introduce our presenters. Patty Ducayet is the State Ombudsman for Texas. She's been in that position for 4 years. Time flies. She has also been a local ombudsman for 3 years, and she's also been the director of aging programs for a nonprofit agency for older adults in Dallas, Texas for 3 years, and she's done some other things as well. If you want to know their academic credentials, they're in the back of the conference program. You can read about those. Suzanna Swanson is currently the Dallas County Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program Supervisor. She's been in this position for 6 years. She supervises 6 local ombudsmen who provide visits and representation to residents in 65 nursing homes and 170 assisted living facilities. Suzanna also has done some other work in tutoring and mentoring programs for older adults for 3 years. So they bring a wealth of experience in different kinds of capacities in terms of relationship building and dialogue. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, why synchronicity? So when I was a kid, and I am a lover of the Olympics, and when I was a kid, synchronized swimming was very big. So put into your mind the synchronized efforts of 2 swimmers, 2 athletes in the water who move this way and that way in perfect unison. And at times, they move opposite of each other, but it's all a coordinated effort, and it all works beautifully. You hear commentators talk about the synchronized swimmer who you can't tell the difference between the 2 people. Everybody thinks they're twins. And they get out of the water, and you see that they are 2 entirely different looking people once they are not working together in the water. And so that's the idea about our concept here, is working in unison, working in a coordinated effort to synchronize our efforts and then further our messages. We're going to talk to you about some practical ways that a program can work in tandem between local and state ombudsman, local and local ombudsman, and state ombudsman can do this too. So in fact, that's why we said synchronicity among local and state ombudsman, because it's not just a one-to-one relationship. A definition of synchronicity is events unlikely to occur simultaneously do occur without, so events unlikely to occur simultaneously do occur with a coordinated effort. With communication, support, coordination, we can synchronize our messages and have a stronger, more successful advocacy program. So we all start at different places. Local ombudsmen and state ombudsmen may be new to the program, may have lots of experience in their years, but they all need to work together in this unified state ombudsman program. Volunteers come with different years of experience and sometimes brand new, but they need to be working in unison as well. And still, we have to coordinate those efforts so that we're functioning as a team. Texas history is something you need to know. We are an ombudsman program that operates out of area agencies on aging. The Texas program's history includes a very strong volunteer component. We were early adopters of using volunteers in the program. And we had a state ombudsman who was the first state ombudsman and lasted in the program for 23 years. So when I came on 4 years ago, that was a big change for us. One of the things about Texas that we have identified is that we are really, really busy and overwhelmed working on individual complaints. And so we weren't taking the time to work on more systemic advocacy. So one of the ways that I believe that we can get to a routine practice of systems advocacy is to develop some more coordinated efforts so that the response in one part of Texas is quite similar to another part of Texas in terms of the service that a resident can get. And that's not an easy thing to ask of each local program who has become accustomed to working sort of in independent ways. So why this session was developed. We wanted to talk about some successful activities that we've been engaged in. We've seen change in terms of, I've seen a lot of change in terms of the communication that goes on in our program. And I've seen a change in the way I am perceived by the folks that I work with, and I hope that I've changed the way that local ombudsmen perceive me as well. I hope it's not all in my mind. Also, long-term care ombudsmen, our workload is at an all-time high. Our budgets are at, extremely constrained, and so it feels like the right time to be talking about the need to work together. We use two primary resources here, and Sarah didn't mention the titles, so I want to share them with you. They will be available to you after the conference is over so that you can access them and read them thoroughly. The first is Esprit de Corps, Cultivating Unity in the Statewide Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program. This is a session report from 1999. From a local ombudsman perspective is the way that Sarah and I really see it. It highlights how we can better serve residents, what barriers exist to a successful ombudsman program in the state, and how to give local ombudsmen a sense of being a part of a statewide program, connecting the local ombudsman to that state-level advocacy. The second resource that we relied heavily on for today's session is strengthening the connection between state and local long-term care ombudsmen. This was recently revised and in fact not quite yet released, but will be after the session. Sarah Hunt used the materials from Esprit de Corps and the NALTCO tips, the National Association of Local Long-Term Care Ombudsmen, tips to state ombudsmen. To me, this paper is directed at state long-term care ombudsmen. It describes a vision, and I want to read it to you. I think it's important. The vision of an office of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program functions as a whole, statewide, unified, integrated program, delivering a range of individual, systemic, and educational efforts. That's a pretty tall order, but that's an important vision in terms of really serving the whole expectation of the Older Americans Act. Building a strong, unified ombudsman program is a process. It's one that starts at your first day on the job, whether you're a state or a local long-term care ombudsman. It doesn't stop until 2 years after you've been working on it. It is a continual process. State long-term care ombudsman roles, as I see them described in there, are things like an advocate, a leader, a mentor, and sometimes a cheerleader. And so based on these resources, Suzanna and I will weave in our experiences from Texas and help describe the principles that are presented to you in them. So I want to introduce you to Suzanna Swanson.
Hey. Thanks, Patty. Good afternoon. There are definitely different pieces to the puzzle when working to attain synchronicity between local and state ombudsman programs. And so, like Patty said, we're going to talk about those different pieces and then share examples with you. I think probably the most important piece of that puzzle is communication. Like with any relationship, communication is key to ensuring a good working relationship between both local and state ombudsman programs. If we're not talking with each other and keeping each other informed, it's going to be very difficult for us to be on the same page, working towards the same goals. It's also going to make it harder for us to be effective, and it's going to be harder to build that trust that Sarah referred to earlier. Just like we work to build trust with our residents when we're trying to resolve complaints on their behalf, we need to build trust. Both the local ombudsman need to work to build that trust with the state ombudsman, and then vice versa. So what we need to be effective? Well, first, we need technical assistance. As part of that, local ombudsmen need to hear clear expectations from the state office as far as what those expectations are for the program. What are the goals for us, and what are we going to be expected to do? In Texas, each year Patty provides us with performance measures so that we know how our state office is going to be monitoring our program. It's very difficult to live up to expectations if you don't know what those expectations are, so the better and the clearer those can be communicated, the better. In addition to that, we need the tools that are necessary to help us do our jobs. And one such tool is a policy and procedures manual, which lays out clear expectations for the programs, and it also helps to eliminate guesswork. In Texas, we revised our policy and procedures manual within the past couple of years, and I will say when I started in my job about 6 years ago, we did have a manual, but it was pretty basic. There wasn't a lot of information in there, and honestly, it didn't do much more than sit on my shelf. But now that we've had a revised manual, I find myself referring to it when I have questions about volunteer management or procedures for accessing a residence chart. I definitely refer to that a lot more. It's still a work in progress. I think Patty may reference that a little bit later, but it is definitely a helpful and very necessary tool. Another one is reporting guidelines. In Texas, we switched over to Ombuds Manager back in January. How many of you are using Ombuds Manager? Okay. Pretty much everybody in the room. I will be honest, it has been a very difficult, challenging transition for a lot of the local programs in our state just to adjust to that new reporting system. Thankfully, our state office has been very supportive. They provided us with a lot of hands-on training when we first made that transition. They've also created a desk reference for us to help talk us through the process, and it pretty much references every part of the database, and then they update that as they learn new helpful tips. And then our state office is available for us to consult with by phone and email when we have questions as well. Another helpful tool is volunteer training manuals to use with people that are going through the initial certification process to be volunteers. It just helps us as a state to have a more consistent approach to training our volunteers, and it also helps minimize or eliminate reinventing the wheel for local programs. And then finally, it helps for the state office to share information about helpful contacts and available resources. I know when Patty gets information, maybe about a contact with Medicaid who can help us when we have residents that are trying to apply for Medicaid and get approved, she has contacts that she can share with us when we're having difficulty in situations like that, and that's always very helpful. Along with technical assistance, we also need consultation, which can serve multiple purposes. We need to be able to consult with the state office when, say, we have very difficult or challenging situations. A lot of what we do as ombudsmen deals with very gray issues where there is not a clear right or wrong answer, and so we need to be able to talk situations like that through with our state office just to get some guidance. It helps local ombudsmen feel more supported and helps us to know that we're not out there on our own. And I think it does lend more credibility to this program, state program as a whole, if we're approaching things with a consistent approach. And I'll share an example from our program. We have an assisted living resident, I'll call him Mr. A, and he was at risk for discharge. He has a volatile personality, and he had become verbally aggressive with some of the other residents and with the staff. Told the ombudsman he hadn't done anything wrong, and he begged for her help to be able to stay at the facility. Well, our ombudsman knew him from a previous facility where he had been discharged for striking another resident with her cane. She also knew that he had served time in prison where he had been required to complete an anger management course. And then she knew that he had a frontal lobe injury, which we thought probably was contributing to his outbursts. The dilemma in this situation was how much information to share with the current facility. They had not issued a discharge notice yet, but he was starting to show verbal aggression, and there was some concern that that might escalate to the physical aggression. But he had begged the ombudsman for help to be able to stay, so we weren't really sure how much information to share. Obviously, we have a duty to protect all of the other residents at that facility as well, and so we consulted with Patty and talked through the situation, and she just helped us to be able to look at it with another set of eyes and look at all of the different steps that we could take to determine how much information should be shared. We ultimately communicated with his Medicaid caseworker who knew about this resident's history. He had actually notified the facility, so that took the pressure off of us. And then we were able to talk with the resident, and actually he's doing pretty well still at the facility where he is. Another time where consultation is important is with reporting of abuse, neglect, and exploitation when residents won't consent. As we all know, the Older Americans Act requires us to protect residents' confidentiality, and that applies with those situations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And I'm a licensed social worker, and I'll tell you this is something that is very challenging for me because obviously we want to make sure that those residents are protected as well as all of the other residents that live in that facility, but we also want to respect and protect their right to confidentiality. Thankfully, we don't have a lot of situations where the resident won't give us consent, but when we do, we definitely are going to consult with our state ombudsman because we want her guidance on how to handle that situation. She helps us, again, with a new set of eyes, looking at it to see if there are things that we can do. We also just want to know that she has our back and that we have our support when we have something of that serious of a nature. Another situation where consultation is important is when there's complaints against an ombudsman. Just given the nature of our jobs, we are out there asking a lot of questions. We're digging into people's business when facilities probably don't want us to be. Sometimes we get involved with family situations, and it's inevitable that sometimes people are going to complain about us, often as a way to try to shut us up and to get us to quit looking into the situation. Well, when we get complaints about a local ombudsman, we want to consult with the state ombudsman, one, to let her know about the situation so that if it gets elevated to their level, they can help give a consistent message and also help the local ombudsman feel supported. The state ombudsman can also give us guidance on how to approach the situation. In Dallas, I had a situation with one of my staff. Like Sarah mentioned, I supervised 6 staff ombudsmen, and one of my staff had some difficulty with one of her administrators. This had been going on practically since day one. They both have very strong personalities, but I really felt like the administrator had it out for my staff person. She contacted me, I think it was her second day at this facility, and told me that I needed to pull this ombudsman from the facility and assign a new staff person. She also made some pretty serious allegations, including accusing my staff person of being racist, and she threatened to report her to the commissioner of our state agency as well as the Civil Rights Board and the NAACP. So I immediately consulted with Patty, and she helped me just to look at the situation and talked me through how to address it with the administrator. We talked about contacting the corporate office to discuss our concerns, and then we talked about how to handle it and approach it with my local ombudsman as well. So that was some very helpful guidance for me in that situation. And then finally, I think consultation is very important for keeping our state ombudsman in the loop. Again, that goes a long way to build support and to build trust with our state ombudsman when we are sharing information with them about challenging cases or maybe controversial issues that might get elevated to their level. If they know ahead of time what's going on, it helps them be better prepared to share information, helps them look better, and again, it's going to help build that trust. Situations where I might use that is if I know a family member or somebody from my staff is going to contact one of our state representatives about a situation that we have going on at a facility. We occasionally use that as a way to try to get an ongoing complaint resolved if everything else that we've done hasn't worked. Inevitably, that's going to lead to a legislative inquiry where they're going to contact Patty's office, and it just looks better for our program as a whole if she's already aware and we've been communicating with her. I might also do that in situations where the media contacts me. It kind of depends on the nature of their request, but if they're doing some kind of expose on a facility or something to do with long-term care, not only can Patty give me guidance on how much information I should be sharing with the media, but again, it also just gives the state ombudsman a heads up in case the media contacts them as well. Now I will turn it over to Patty to talk some more about communication.
Hi again. So I want to turn us back to the ever interesting situation of abuse, neglect, and exploitation reporting, a real hot button item. But I wanted to say that this was one of those things that as a state ombudsman, I felt like was pretty non-negotiable. And I literally and figuratively applied the law here and had to, in the last few years, really work to get the local ombudsman to a place where they bought into what our role was and what we were legally required to do. And that was a tricky, tricky thing. Many ombudsmen in Texas, and I'm sure in the country, are not real comfortable about our disclosure policy when it comes to abuse, neglect, and exploitation. So here's what I've found as a state ombudsman that's really important, and it's basic, and it's about communication. When the local ombudsman contacts me with a sticky situation where they suspect or have been told that abuse or neglect or exploitation is occurring, it's important for the state ombudsman to recognize the weight of that information, to let the local ombudsman know that it's must be tough to be dealing with this. So recognizing it. The state ombudsman, I feel it's so critical that we listen to the concerns of the ombudsman and help them explore what their concerns really are, what is at the root of their concerns. That's a part of helping them understand and helping the state ombudsman discover what is the right course to take in response to the information that the ombudsman has received. Third, I would say that it's really the role of the state ombudsman here to provide guidance and direction. I believe, much like what Suzanna said, it offers the local ombudsman the support they need to know that the step they're going to take next is with the approval and the full weight of the ombudsman program behind them. And that really, under these tricky circumstances, becomes immensely important. Our guidance may be that we're not sure what the local ombudsman is asking for. I know I have been on many consultation calls with the local ombudsman, and I wasn't quite sure what they were looking for. And so I also think it's the state ombudsman's responsibility to ask, what is it that I can help you figure out? If we're going round and round but we're not making progress, maybe I just need you to tell me. And so hopefully your state ombudsman will ask you that, but know that sometimes you've got to spell it out for us too. It may not be so obvious. So continuing on with communication, I want to talk a little about program management and ways that we have found synchronizing our work is really, really important. So I've alluded to this, getting support from the state ombudsman, but I want to say too, getting support from the state ombudsman in writing can be an important part of sort of your procedure, and also can be it is a higher level of confidence that it gives the local ombudsman, and it's a higher level of support because it's there in black and white. And I find there are certain circumstances that we have decided we want to give written approval for things. Some examples are tricky decisions where a volunteer is going to be terminated from the program. Well, I don't know about you guys, but our volunteers sometimes really fight that termination. And so having something in writing where the state ombudsman was consulted and you have a record from the state ombudsman that this was a joint decision can be a really helpful tool in giving you the confidence that the decision you're making about a termination from the program is supported. Another important one is conflicts of interest. Certainly procedurally we require this, a written approval by the state ombudsman, but a written approval of the remedy to resolve any conflict of interest that might have been identified is critically important, so that you have the support that we've talked this through and we're in agreement about how to remedy a conflict. And here's an important success story for our program, is knowing that now local ombudsmen really identify their own conflicts of interest, they self-disclose them to me, and they come to me to ask for a resolution together. We work one out. That did not used to happen in Texas. It was more of an avoidance for us. We didn't want to deal with it. And so this is a big deal to have done the work of educating statewide, educating on what conflicts of interest are, why they're so important to remove or remedy, and to know that local ombudsmen trust me enough to call me and discuss it. And yes, sometimes I have to give them the tough answer of that's not something I'm comfortable with and can't keep them in the program. But still they call, still they seek me out, and that just really is a sign of improvement for us. It's great. When it comes to personnel, we have the structure in Texas of a AAA where the Ombudsman program is operated, and in 3 programs they're subcontracted from the AAA into a nonprofit organization. But what's important there is that in our state, I do not hire and fire the staff ombudsman. So I wanted to ask Suzanna to come up and talk a little about how we've made that work, because it's complicated.
All Right. Well, I know that there is variation, not just in our state, but across the country as far as how programs are set up. But for those of you who supervise other staff ombudsmen, like I do, it can be very helpful to communicate with your state ombudsman regarding personnel issues. Specifically, if you're responsible for hiring somebody, like Patty said, she doesn't make those decisions. She's not responsible for hiring the staff. But I find it very helpful to communicate with her and consult with her. I had a situation last month where I had an open staff position, and it was a very rare occurrence in that I had multiple candidates that looked really good, and I was having a hard time choosing between them. And so I talked with Patty, I shared their qualifications, and she helped me look at how those qualifications would then translate into their role as an ombudsman. And through that conversation, I was able to narrow it down and then finally decide who I felt would be the best person for that position, and made that hire. It's also important in situations where, with staff ombudsmen, where it may lead to a need for them to be terminated. We all hate to be in situations like that, but occasionally it does happen. And so if you consult with your state ombudsman, he or she can help you look at the situation and see if there are other alternate solutions to try first. But if it does lead to where the staff person does end up being terminated, it's important to communicate that with the state ombudsman, because they are the one that certifies that individual. They'll need to decertify them. It's also good to give them the heads up in case there's any backlash from that person who has been terminated. That way they are prepared.
And on every occasion, Suzanna does a great job of keeping me in the loop. You know, I think that a local ombudsman, in my eyes, is a real star at communication with their state ombudsman when they think about what would rise to the attention, what's at risk of rising to the attention of their state ombudsman. Letting me know gives me the opportunity to be prepared for anything that may come my way and to support you better in the long run. That's just really huge for me. So now I want to talk about a milestone for us in Texas. When I started, I was facing AAA directors that were very mistrusting of the state ombudsman and kind of angry at the long-term care ombudsman program and services, just frustrated about where things were going. And I felt a lot of animosity with AAA directors, and these were the folks that the contract is with in Texas, and in most cases, they're the ones hiring and firing the local ombudsman. So obviously, it's a really important relationship for me. And I started off pretty low there, but it's come a long way. The first thing I remember telling them in a group was, I am not the boss of your long-term care ombudsman. You're the boss. And that went a long way to them seeing that I got the complexity of the relationship. I went on to say that although I'm not the boss, I have a big part in this program, and we have got to work together. And then the message needed to continue each time I had the opportunity to speak with them, to talk about how I needed to be involved. And I showed them how I needed to be involved. And I think the big milestone for us this year was that in the spring of this year, I met with all the AAA directors and had an opportunity to give an overview of the Older Americans Act, the Ombudsman provisions in the Older Americans Act, and really talk about the basis in the law for our program. It was very much based on Sarah Hunt's paper about the unique characteristics of the long-term care ombudsman program. That's also completely incorporated into our National Ombudsman Resource Center curriculum for long-term care ombudsman. And that really just hit it home. I mean, they just really get it in a new way. And it was also a great opportunity to press on the systems advocacy work that is a part of the Older Americans Act, and to tell the AAA directors in Texas, we may not have been doing this before, we're going to start. And I need you all to understand where that comes from, our responsibility to represent the interests of residents. So I'm feeling good about that relationship, and it's taken 4 years to get there, and it'll get rocky again, I'm sure. It's complicated stuff, but I do think it too is a lot about building trust and working on that relationship. a moment, I want to take a moment also in program management to talk about, from a state ombudsman perspective, the tricky thing about local programs and the size of those programs. We have programs as large as Suzanna's, 7 staff, and then 1 person, long-term care ombudsman programs. That's a really different experience for those two programs. Sure, the foundation of the work is identical, but it's tough in different ways. There are different demands on those programs. And so the months that maybe the Dallas program is keeping me very busy with technical assistance and consultation calls, I've got to think about that I've got to be reaching out to the small one-person ombudsman program and making sure that they're not getting lost in the big picture. And so a state ombudsman has to work on balancing the demands of those programs, and it's a really important thing that I work on every day to remember. Another part of that is recognizing programs, and we have a newsletter, and that's a great opportunity to recognize the success of a program, and that means making sure that I share that recognition across the state and with different local programs. It also means when we have statewide training and we want to have a highlight of a great practice in a local program, that I can't put the same 2 ombudsmen up in front of the audience every time, or that doesn't look and feel right. That doesn't smell right. And it's not recognizing the great skills of local ombudsmen all over the place. Just because a program is big or has had history of success doesn't mean that everyone doesn't want an opportunity to teach and to learn and to be recognized. One other thing that I think is program management related and worthy of sharing is that when it comes to program monitoring, I also have to think about the size of the program and what my expectations are. For instance, we have a performance measure, we have in rule that long-term care ombudsman must maintain continuing education 12 hours every year. And a state ombudsman needs to know what can be flexible in those requirements. So 12 hours is required, but how you get to those 12 hours may need more flexibility depending on the size and resources dedicated to an individual local ombudsman program. Okay, handing off to Suzanna again.
All right, well, in conjunction with good lines of communication, we also need support. Local ombudsmen need to know that we're not out there by ourselves. The recognition that Patty was talking about at the state trainings, that's one form of support that we need, and that's an excellent way to give it. But like I said, we need to know that we're not out there alone and that the state office will support our actions and defend us when needed. Having open communication is definitely an excellent way to show support, so the two really do go hand in hand. But I wanted to talk about some situations where support is really important. The first one is when there are complaints against an ombudsman. Just like I mentioned earlier when I was talking about consultation, we do need to consult so that we get some guidance on how to handle those situations. But again, we need to know that the state office is supporting the local ombudsman as well. You know, it can be pretty unsettling when people start complaining about you. I mean, I think we all try to have pretty thick skin. You kind of have to when you're out there advocating and everything, but it still can be hard when people are complaining. And the situation with my staff person, she expressed some anxiety about those complaints from that administrator. Those were some pretty serious allegations that the administrator was making, and my staff person even expressed just not worrying just about her job, but also just the impact that it was going to have on her personally. So in that situation, Patty and I worked together, and we approached the situation with the understanding or the thought that the local ombudsman had handled herself appropriately and she had followed proper ombudsman procedure. We gave her an opportunity to share with us her side of the story before we went back and talked with the administrator any further. And along the way, we did everything we could to help her feel supported, just to know that she wasn't out there alone. Another situation where that support is very helpful is when we are working on big complaints or ongoing issues at a facility. it's very easy to start feeling burned out when you have those ongoing situations and you feel like you have done everything you can do and you're still not seeing results, you're not seeing changes. We had a situation at a home in Dallas County where we had just had ongoing complaints about the care as well as environmental concerns. Just to kind of paint the picture for you, there were holes in the wall. The ceiling leaked every time it rained. It would leak through the exit sign. The residents had been exposed to asbestos. It was not uncommon to walk in and find flies resting on residents that can't move. The staff and volunteer ombudsman at that home had both expressed complaints to the administrator multiple times. They had filed complaints with regulatory. Nothing was done. I went with them and we met with the representative from the corporate office who made empty promises, still no changes. And I saw both my staff and volunteer ombudsman really getting frustrated and discouraged because, again, nothing they did seemed to be making any changes. So we consulted with Patty, and she immediately acknowledged their efforts and appreciation for everything that they had done up to that point, and she encouraged them to keep fighting it, and we talked about some other avenues to pursue. After talking with her, we did end up going ahead and filing another complaint with regulatory. This time we put it in writing and we notified the state representative for the area where that home is located. And let me tell you, we got some results by doing that. They sent a new team of surveyors out there and they were appalled by what they found. They found multiple residents with bed sores that weren't being treated. They found residents covered in ant bites, and the one that still gets me today, they found a gentleman chewing on an electrical cord that was plugged into the wall. So they cited 6 immediate jeopardies. The home could not get those cleared, and so they were required to bring in an outside party to oversee the care there. And finally, we started seeing some improvement. Would we have gone that route if we hadn't consulted with Patty? I don't know, because again, we were getting pretty discouraged. But I'm so thankful that we did, because if we hadn't, who knows what would have happened to those residents. And I do think that we probably were pretty close to losing our volunteer at that point. It was also very helpful that we had consulted with her, because we got some backlash from it from the state regulatory agency. The regional director was not happy with us that we had notified the representative. She really felt like we should be working with them locally, which we had tried to do. And so Patty was there to support us when we started getting some complaints about that. Another area where support is helpful is when the local ombudsman needs legal representation. And I'm curious, how many of you have been in a situation where you've needed legal representation? Okay, several of you. It doesn't happen very often, but when you are put in that situation, it's nice to know that that representation is out there and that you've got the support of your state ombudsman. It happened to me personally a few years ago. I had a resident in assisted living who had some dementia, but she had not been adjudicated incompetent. She wanted to move home, which was in a different part of the state, but her daughter, who had medical power of attorney, refused to let her move because it was more convenient for her to be there in Dallas. The resident also was a little concerned and upset with the daughter about some other medical decisions that she had been making for her. The staff at the nursing home notified me of the concern about the resident, and so I went out and visited with this resident, and she again voiced complaints, and I talked with her about her rights, and she decided that she wanted to revoke the daughter's power of attorney. The facility wasn't very helpful with that, and so I stepped in and I got the resident connected with a legal aid agency in Texas, and she did revoke that power of attorney. Within a few days, I got a very nasty letter from the daughter's attorney. And it was unsettling for me. I hadn't been in that situation before, so I contacted Patty, and she immediately got me legal representation. And from that point forward, the 2 attorneys talked, and I was taken out of it at that point. And it really was just a matter of educating that attorney and the daughter about our program, our role, what the Older Americans Act says that we are to do for our residents, and what residents' rights are. And once the attorney stepped in, it got resolved pretty quickly. But it helped knowing that I had that support there, and that legal representation was so readily available when I needed it. We've also used it in a situation with one of my staff who had been very involved with a resident who had been a victim of financial exploitation by his daughter. and he had reached out to the Ombudsman to help him, and she ultimately ended up having to testify at a guardianship hearing for him. And just because of the controversial nature of his situation, we did get legal representation for her, which was very helpful, because that process took about 1.5 years, so it was a drawn-out process for her. Just real quickly, 2 other times when support are helpful is visiting facilities together. I do that with my volunteers. I've started doing that recently, going out with my volunteers, and I've gotten great feedback from them. It's a way for them to show me their home and to introduce me to the residents that they interact with, and it gives me an opportunity to see them in action, and it also allows me to give them positive feedback and show appreciation for the effort that they're making. Patty does something very similar where she goes out and visits the local programs, and it's just a great way for her to acknowledge their efforts as well. And then I think statewide training is a great way to give support to local programs. One, it's a way to give us meaningful training, give us new tools to help us do our jobs. It's a way to express appreciation, and it counters isolation for those people in the programs like Patty mentioned, where maybe there's just one person in that program. It's a way to bring them together with other ombudsmen from around the state. One thing that Patty has started in our state is having local programs host statewide training. It used to be that we would just go to Austin to Patty's office several times a year, and now local programs are coordinating training and having everybody come to them instead. We did that in Dallas about 1 year ago, and it was great. Obviously we communicated a lot with Patty's office, but we had the responsibility of deciding on the topics, lining up the speakers, and then welcoming everybody. It was a great way for us to showcase our program. So I think that's a great way to do it if you can. But I also know that times are tight financially. We've actually scaled back on the number of trainings that we do in person, and we now have, I would say, probably 5 or 6 webinars that Patty's office hosts each year. And that's actually been great for us as well, because I've got 7 staff in my program. We can't all afford to go down to Austin each time we have training. When we have webinars, we're all able to participate and hear that information firsthand, and it is so much better when you can hear it for yourself instead of having somebody come back and share that with you. So that's just another great way to do training if you're able to. And then once you have that communication and support in place and build that stronger relationship, how do we keep local programs connected to the statewide program? Well, first, involve local ombudsmen in statewide activities. Identify their strengths and interests, and then invite them to participate in some way based on those interests. One way to do that is to invite them to serve as a state representative for a task force or a work group. In Texas, the Department of Aging and Disability Services is the agency where the state ombudsman office is housed. Our regulatory agency is housed there as well. And occasionally they will have work groups to address long-term care issues, including looking at the regulations. And I'm fortunate in that I have a full-time assisted living ombudsman, and so she really has become an expert on assisted living issues, and she has served on several work groups. The most recent one had to do with medication administration in the assisted living facilities, and from that experience she has been able to keep Patty informed during that process, and then she actually turned it into a training session at a statewide training where she got local ombudsmen from around the state talking about the issue, and then through a group activity she actually took us through the experience of what it's like to serve on a work group. And so that was a great recognition of her skills that we were able to share. And then I also think it's important to encourage local ombudsman participation in systemic advocacy, both nationally and the state level. I've participated in Senior Day at the Capitol, where different groups have interest in senior issues flood the Capitol on one day, and they go and meet with state representatives and their staff and talk about those issues. We've also invited state representatives to come out and tour the facilities in our area so that they can get a feel for what it's like for the residents in those homes. And then on the more national level, back in February, I got to testify at the AOA's listening forum for the Older Americans Act reauthorization, and I can't tell you what an amazing experience that was. Just to tell you a little bit about what we did, I consulted with our executive director at my agency and then consulted with Patty, and we decided that we wanted to testify on the need for funding for assisted living ombudsmen. Talked with Patty to get some more background of the program, the history of the funding, and then I identified one of my certified volunteers who is an amazing advocate, amazing speaker, very passionate about what she does, and then the three of us testified on the same day. We were only given 2 minutes each to speak, but because there were three of us, it was like we had 6 minutes to get our message across, and so we really were able to hit home all of the different points that we wanted to share. If you're a local ombudsman, I encourage you to do it. Never did I think I would ever be testifying at, yeah, it was really cool. It was a little intimidating, but in the long run, it was very neat to know that I was speaking up not only for my program, other programs in the state, but also programs across the country. If you're a state ombudsman, I encourage you to encourage your local ombudsman to do that. It's helped me feel so much more connected to the ombudsman program and just our work as a whole.
If you haven't listened to the testimony of Ruth Hancock or read it on the AOA website, you can view it. And she was the volunteer ombudsman who was after I had gone and then immediately after Suzanna. And boy, did she hit it home. She talked about a resident in an assisted living facility, and it really helped. We built upon each other on our testimony, and that's what made it successful. And it's because we talked about what were our strategies here that we were so successful. Plus, Susanna's fabulous, as is Ruth Hancock. So a couple of other notes on coordination, and then we're going to move into our opportunity for tabletop discussion. I would say that our goal of coordination in Texas, and maybe for you, is we wanted to create a culture of feedback in our state. Make sure that feedback and communication was a two-way street. And so I've encouraged local programs to work together, to do things regionally, to go out, make plans to meet at a facility in one area and let local ombudsmen from a neighboring area see what it's like there and tour a different facility, to have lunch together at that regional level, to meet regularly with regulatory in the region as well as local ombudsmen from a larger region and talk about big problems, corporate level problems in facilities, and have your peers next to you for the support to present information to regulatory in a different format than in an annual survey. It really has made a difference for our relationships. Another thing about communicating, creating a culture of feedback is that if I'm going to go anywhere near a long-term care ombudsman's area, I need to let them know. Normally, I'm going to be going there to see them and to see a facility with them, but if it's for some other reason, there can be an opportunity to pull the ombudsman, the local ombudsman in. So meetings that are in Dallas area, Susanna's invited to participate in CMS meetings with me, and so together, the local and state ombudsmen are representing the state as a whole, and I think it presents a better message to providers in the room associated with nursing home regulation and such. Also, if the commissioner of my agency is going to be in an ombudsman region and I know about it and it's aging content that he might be speaking about, it's important to let the local ombudsman know what's going on. I mean, who wants to know that happened after the fact? I mean, that just really makes you feel like you're out of the loop. So keeping people in the loop is also a two-way street. Last thing, and you have this on your slides, I want to mention disaster coordination and disaster response and recovery. It seems that in times of crisis, this is a real opportunity for us to go a different level in terms of our relationship. And I mean state and local ombudsmen and local ombudsmen that are neighbors. We can really step up for each other in a crisis, and I bet if you've ever had a facility that closed in an emergency, you were working with your neighboring local long-term care ombudsman. Your state ombudsman can be a great support too, and I've gone out to closures so that I could be alongside with the local ombudsman. That has been a great opportunity to really see what it's like, the pressures and the crisis of a closure. And in things like a disaster that occurs, in those situations where people are forced to evacuate from their home and from an entire area, ombudsmen have really felt appreciated when I found them. You know, I sought them out to make sure they were okay, and I could communicate to their peers that we know where the Ombudsman is. I mean, Hurricane Ike was a big deal in Texas. It affected many areas, and we had ombudsmen who lost their homes. So we needed to know that people were okay and check in. And so, and then when residents were able to come back to their homes, we needed to coordinate our efforts and pitch in maybe in ways that we don't do on a day-to-day basis, but we do in times of crisis. I think helping out in that time of crisis can really create a really special bond among any of the long-term care ombudsman family. I wanted to say to you that a lesson I learned as a state ombudsman is that and the one I think is worth sharing, is that you have to know as a state ombudsman what's negotiable about your program and what's not. I mentioned a non-negotiable was how we were going to deal with allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation that we received in the program. There are others. Some tough decisions that I had to make as a state ombudsman include deciding that our volunteers needed the same access that a long-term care staff ombudsman had. And that wasn't a pretty decision, and you know, some of the local ombudsmen were not comfortable with this, access to records, access to confidential information, but it was a change in the program that I was confident I had the support in the law to make, and that through work and education and talking it through, we have come to a new understanding in our state about the capabilities and the demands and responsibilities on our volunteer ombudsman. And finally, I would say that it was a tough decision to buy a new system for managing our data. Suzanna mentioned that. There was a crisis, and it wasn't exactly easy, and I struggled with that decision. So when sometimes your state ombudsman has to make a tough decision and it can't have a lot of input from the local ombudsman beforehand, then it's important to recognize as a state ombudsman that you've got to work with your local ombudsman about how we're going to make it work together. And so that's why all the education has come in afterwards. That was the way we had to do it in that circumstance. So we're going to stop with the presentation portion, and we're going to take a quick break and reorganize ourselves so that we can get into discussion groups. We're going to break into 2 groups now, and I'll let Suzanna give you a couple of directions.
All right, as Patty said, we're going to break into 2 groups, and we have some situations that we're going to give to each of the groups for you to discuss. You'll have 10 minutes to discuss as a group. You need to elect or select a reporter for each group, and then the reporter is going to report the themes of the discussion. After you've had some time to discuss it as a group, then the reporter will come up and have about 2 minutes to report on that situation. So if you will work to keep your answers concise as possible on that. So we'll go ahead and hand out the situations for you to discuss. It says a local program is at risk of budget cuts. $60,000 is slated for cutbacks by the county government from an urban area ombudsman program. The county funding has been granted for the last 12 years and funds a significant portion of a staff ombudsman position. The state contracts for ombudsman services through area agencies on aging. A public hearing about proposed budget cuts is scheduled in 3 weeks. And the 2 questions for discussions were: what activities or roles seem appropriate to advocate for budget restoration by the state and local ombudsman? And how can the local and state ombudsmen synchronize their advocacy as far as communicating and coordinating their message on this issue? So if the reporter for Group 1 will step up to the microphone, and Sarah will let you know when your 2 minutes are up.
Well, we discussed that you have to put a face to this. You have to put your passion, and you have to let people know in the right positions, such as our legislators. One of our ombudsmen spoke about having to deal with this through the legislation, and that the governor got involved, and that they had to pull together some reports to show that the need of the program and how important it was. They also communicated with the state ombudsman as well, and the state ombudsman got involved. And so it helps just to do what we are talking about today, as in communication and synchronizing and coming together as a team, and just having teamwork. So basically that's what we talked about, is that there are areas that you can cut back, but they're not really good things to do, because in the long run, the resident is the one that suffers. You know, if you cut back on your visits, the resident suffers. If you cut back on mileage and things to that nature, the resident suffers, because, you know, there's so many things that go into that. It's all about money, and when we start making money be the focus instead of relationship, we're getting a little out of sync of what our program is all about. And our program is about resident-centered quality care, and making sure that these residents are cared for.
Thank you. It sounds like y'all had excellent discussion. Some of the things that I heard that really stood out to me were putting a face on the issue, going to higher levels, obviously talking with the state ombudsman, and then using data as far as pulling those reports to show why the position in the program are so important. So thank y'all very much. All right, the next group worked on situation number 4, complaint against a local ombudsman. A state ombudsman receives a call from an administrator alleging a local ombudsman referred people to a nursing home in return for payment. The local ombudsman is a volunteer with 15 years of service to the program. The local staff ombudsman was hired 2 months ago and is responsible for training and supervising volunteers in her program within a AAA. The administrator provides considerable facts to support her story. The 2 questions that the group addressed were, how can the state ombudsman initially respond to the administrator without undermining the local staff ombudsman's role? And describe a strategy for investigating and responding to this complaint with the state and local ombudsman both involved. So if the reporter will please come forward.
Well, as a group, we decided that the state ombudsman could listen to the concerns of the administrator, maybe gather some information, and then let that administrator know that there's a local program and that the situation should really be dealt with that program. And then once it's referred on to that program, the state ombudsman can have contact with that local ombudsman, the staff person that's hired, and have a conversation with them about some approaches that that person can have with their volunteer. And then that staff person can have a conversation on their own with the volunteer and ask questions about what happened, and then maybe give a report back to the ombudsman for what ideas they should do to fix the problem.
Again, sounds like more good discussion, and again, what I heard as far as talking with the state ombudsman, having conversations about approaches, again, that goes back to what we said earlier with that communication and working together. I think that's so important, so thank y'all very much. One of the slides that we, in the handout that we didn't get to earlier, wanted to go ahead and talk about now. As Patty mentioned earlier, we use several different resources in preparing for today's session. One of them was titled, What Do Local Long-Term Care Ombudsmen Need from Their State Long-Term Care Ombudsman? Tips from the National Association of Local Long-Term Care Ombudsmen. And this is a document that was prepared back in October 2005. We've provided a copy of that for you today. I think there are definitely some good tips on there. I'm not going to read them to you, but I did want to point out just a few of them. It talks about the state ombudsman being the expert in long-term care and sharing that information and their expertise with the local ombudsman. Also talks about the importance of visiting the local ombudsman in their offices. We both talked about that a little bit today during our presentations, and I think that goes a long way to showing support, but also getting to know the local programs, getting a feel for what their area is like. As Patty said, in Texas alone, we've got programs where we have 1 staff person versus my program that has 7. We have some that serve urban areas where others are more rural, and it just helps to give a feel for the state ombudsman to have a better understanding of what the situation is like for those programs. So I do think that's important. And then the last one talks about being very clear with the sponsoring agency of the local ombudsman program regarding what the responsibilities are. Don't leave the local ombudsman to take on that battle alone. Stand up for what the local ombudsman roles and/or rules are, such as confidentiality of files. And I think that is huge because, again, local ombudsmen need to know that we are not out there alone. We need our state ombudsman to step in, especially in situations like that, because chances are the sponsoring agency may not have a real clear understanding of the ombudsman program. That's where the state ombudsman can step in just to help clarify that for them and educate them. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Patty to talk about some tips from Texas.
So one last time from me. So one of the things that NASOP has agreed they might be interested in, and they've agreed to work on creating a set of tips for local ombudsmen from the National Association of State Ombudsman program perspective. We thought it might be a nice companion piece to the tips that are given to state long-term care ombudsmen. And so to start that off, I don't have NASOP endorsement with these. These are my Texas tips to local long-term care ombudsmen, and just a few. Give the state long-term care ombudsman a chance to earn your respect. That was one of the things that, honestly, in Texas, I didn't struggle with at all. I was given a chance, and that's really all anyone asks for, because being new, whether you're a local or a state ombudsman, is tough. And there's a lot thrown at you at once. And it's good to know that people are giving you the benefit of the doubt from the start, and then you can prove yourself and earn that respect along the way. It can be really, really scary to have a new boss, meaning a state ombudsman or a state ombudsman with a new boss. Everybody can feel there's a lot of upheaval associated with that, but I think if you go in with the right attitude about that, it can make a big difference and actually make the experience much better for you as well as your boss. Secondly, tell your state long-term care ombudsman what you need. Communication, as we've described, is not just a description of the communication that I gave to local ombudsman. It is equally important for the local ombudsman to communicate with me. Also, it means I need to know what's a problem for you. What do you need? Advocate for yourself. I do find that ombudsmen, sometimes we do a great job of advocating for residents, and we don't always stand up for ourselves and what we need to be a good advocate. And so that's a message I want to share with you. Try to understand the role and the challenges that your state ombudsman faces. That might not be exactly clear to you, but I think you'll understand, you'll get messages from that person, and I think it's an opportunity for you to empathize with the special challenges associated with the position. Also let them know what your challenges are through communication so that they build empathy about some of the tougher things that you go through on a daily basis. And finally, I mentioned to you in our handout appreciating diversity of our programs. And that speaks a little to the small or large sized program, but it's also urban or rural or frontier based programs. And recognize that you can learn things from other local long-term care ombudsmen as well as across the border of a state. And so I do think that coming here is incredibly important. Make it a priority for your program and get here so that you can learn about other programs too. There is a little bit of grass is greener, I think, sometimes that happens. I know I experienced that in my first couple of years as a state ombudsman. Oh, I wish we could just do it the way they do it in that state. But I've come to find out that there are many reasons why a state ombudsman program has developed the way it has in a state. And there are a lot of things that have factored into how the program has developed. So sometimes a sea change is not all it's cracked up to be. Sometimes it's really necessary. So work with your ombudsman in your state to learn about where the development of your state structure came from. And again, give that state ombudsman the benefit of the doubt. I think that you've heard from us today time and time again that it is all about relationships. We talked about communication and coordination and support, but it's the relationship, our relationship with each other, that is at the heart of this matter. So I want to thank you for your time today, and I want to invite Sarah Hunt now to join us to the front, and Sarah's going to open up an opportunity for you if you'd like to share some good things that have happened in your state that would demonstrate how you've synchronized your work together.
So what we'd like is to enlarge the pool of ideas that you've given us a really good foundation for. So if any of you have some ideas about what works in your state or what you wish you had in your state to foster this sense of you are on the same page and you're all part of a team, and the communication, the support, the dialogue, the management practices, please stand up and go to the mic and let us know.
Well, I can cite something in particular is that when all these new programs roll out and we get a new director and they have all kinds of new ideas about how they want to communicate by computer to save money, in my particular experience as an older ombudsman, I find I am just way below the learning curve of learning some new techniques on the computer, and I'm the only ombudsman in my area, so I would like to see more hands-on tech support to be able to figure out some of the things without always having to call the agency, which is an hour away from me, to get some hands-on experience when the director is very, very busy and doesn't have much time to even assist me without having to go down to a local college and ask for help.
That's a really good point and a tip. I know some programs that send a lot of information by email also have to mail hard copies to a certain number of people, especially when you have a lot of volunteers who may not have easy access to the internet. But the point you made about needing tech support when things don't work smoothly or you need to learn something different is a really valid point. And it's something to consider that programs may need to start thinking about how we're going to build this in and provide it to people. Okay, another tip.
Well, in Iowa, our state ombudsman found that she was having a lot of challenges with time and responding to the 8 local ombudsmen. So something that she created was a weekly report that all of us do, and it just kind of gives her the information of what's going on in our facilities and if we have any challenging cases. And then it also leaves an opportunity for us to ask questions or ask her for any follow-up to other things that we might not have gotten a response back to.
Let me clarify, is that a report that the state ombudsman sends to you or you send to the state ombudsman?
We send to the state ombudsman.
And could you give us kind of the bullets of what you put in that report?
Yep, we have, the first part is the facility updates, and maybe if one of the facilities in our area has a big fine, or if they're going through decertification, she probably knows about that, but maybe an update about that, or if they lost their ability to accept Medicare, Medicaid residents, she'd like to know that and maybe didn't have the opportunity to see that. And then also there's a section for unusual cases and or program activities, and we put in maybe some cases that we're struggling with and we might have some questions about, and we can just say, see case and please call me about that. And then she can look an ombuds manager at that particular case. And then also there's a place, like I said, for questions and follow-up. So if we have particular questions, not necessarily about a case, but just things going on in our program, we can ask her there, and then she'll respond back to that.
Great, thank you. And I can see how, from a state ombudsman perspective, that would be a really big asset to knowing where you need to focus some systems advocacy issues. We may contact Jean and see if we can get that form and put it up on the website as another tip or idea for people to download with these materials. Okay, somebody else, another tip or idea or wish you had?
I'll say one thing that we do in our program is we synchronize our calendars on a weekly basis, actually, and then our managing ombudsman coordinates with the state ombudsman program. We also CC them in on emails if we need to do that, so that they kind of know what's going on with our program. But the calendar thing works really great. We're on Outlook, and it's great because if I need to know where one of the other ombudsmen is, I can just look on that and find out where they are, and then or I email them or I send them a text message or a voicemail message if they need to get on a case quickly. That way that we all know what's going on.
Okay, thank you. Another tip, good practice idea, and maybe it's not your state, but it's one that you've heard an ombudsman talk about.
Hi, when Sarah was mentioning the weekly report from, and asking you about weekly report up to your state ombudsman, I know of some state ombudsmen who do a wonderful job of sending a weekly report to across the state of information that the state office has been working on for the week. And I think that that is a wonderful strategy for, one, helping local ombudsmen see what kind of work goes on in the state office, but also helping inform them about statewide activities that may affect the local ombudsman down the road too. I think that's a fabulous practice.
Let's thank our two presenters for putting this together.